Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Laura Schmidt, who is the founding director of the Good Grief Network and co-creator of their 10 Steps to Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate and Flow Facilitation Program, as well as co-author of How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, to discuss all things Good Grief Network resources, eco-anxiety, the power of sitting with our grief, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laura. It's truly an honor.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like this has been a long time coming. I really, really appreciate everything that you've been doing, and I guess like to get started, you've previously described yourself as having long been captivated by the human condition. Can you tell me more about that and how your personal background has shaped what you do today?
Yeah, it's a great question with a lot of, I think, weight to it, a lot of density to it. I was forced to be a survivor from an early age. I was surrounded by a lot of abuse and neglect and poverty. And I think when I was growing up and trying to formulate thoughts and feelings around it, I took it really personally. Like, why couldn't my parents be better people?
Mm.
And as I learned more and studied more and grew more, I realized that the world we live in, this Western paradigm, is creating a whole society of deeply wounded people, and hurt people end up hurting people. And as we continue to create mass trauma without resources and connection to help us actually heal, then of course we're creating abusers, we're creating conditions for neglect and poverty, which is a different social issue but intimately connected. And then one step further, when I started learning about intergenerational trauma, it's I'm so captivated by how we survive, how we choose to move through really difficult things. My grandmother and my great aunt were Holocaust survivors, and my family is not Jewish, but nonetheless, they were rounded up and put into concentration camps. And of course, that leaves a legacy. Of course, that has me questioning why do we survive? What keeps us alive? Why so much hurt and struggle? Why so much beauty? And how can we harness the reality that to struggle and to be alive is part of the human condition? And how do we harness those realities for collective transformation?
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that phrase hurt people is really impactful. Um, I guess like from there then, can you tell us more about the mission of the Good Grief Network and where it all began?
Yeah, another very big, wide question that I can try to answer quite concisely. The mission essentially is to bring people together to have the hard conversations and normalize processing heavy and painful feelings about the state of the world, and then helping people arrive at meaningful action. And we don't tell you what your meaningful action is. We kind of pave a path so you can discover it yourself. And it all began because of this obsession of the human condition and of resilience and of me wanting to be a change maker in the world, and realizing because of this past that I've already explained, I didn't really have a lot of resilience tools in my tool belt. So a lot of it was studying, a lot of it was trying to figure out, okay, if people are looking at the climate crisis, if people are looking at climate justice issues, how do they sustain themselves? And it ended up being a roadmap, which became the 10-step program. And then my now wife helped me really breathe life into the program, where we actually created the program and then founded the nonprofit to house the program. And it's just been growing since then. But it began with an earnest desire to change these really dysfunctional, unjust, soul-sucking systems,
Yeah,
because we can do things differently, and we have to start somewhere. So this is our initiative to start somewhere.
I love that. And I mean, I guess like I also wanted to pick your brains about this, like the founding of a nonprofit process. Like, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you faced so far? And I guess like what are some of the biggest lessons that you've gained?
Oof. Oof. It has been one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And it's because I was not well equipped to found a nonprofit. As I said earlier, we actually created a program and then realized that we needed to create a structure around the program to house it. And so I think one of the biggest hurdles is that I'm an idealist, I'm a writer, I'm a facilitator. My skill set was not that of like running a business or trying to figure out how to do that. So having to skill up and learn some of these things to run a nonprofit was the hardest part. And I think that a lot of people who are able to start a nonprofit have different resources that they can call on. And we started so small that we didn't have a lot of resources. So it's kind of like, really pushing through, like we self-funded for a long time and we like really built this off of our backs. And we're finally at a stage where we have a really engaged board. We have a lot of people who support us, and there's a lot of momentum to helping us grow. But certainly, I would have done a lot of things differently, and would have asked for help a lot more along the way.
Gotcha. Yeah, what are some of those things that you would have done differently if you don't mind me asking?
Well, one is I would have tried to really understand the difference between business structures. I came from a nonprofit background right after graduate school. I worked for a few years in a nonprofit, so it felt kind of like, the next best step is to incorporate as a nonprofit for good grief. Would have gotten a more engaged board from the get-go. It's hard when you're so small and you're just like, my priority is the work, but to do the work in a sustainable way and to take care of the people behind the scenes to be able to pay us salaries, you need a functional structure. So I think that I would have done a little bit more mindful board construction, actually understanding how to create a functional nonprofit, how to, like, grants have been a bit of an issue for us along the way. And so I think, hindsight is always such a gift and
Yeah.
maybe a curse as well. But like just trying to find the people and put them in the right place in the organization so that the organization can grow in an equitable way.
It's really insightful. Thank you. Um, I guess so. The next question, what advice do you have for listeners who would like to practice reconnection in their own lives?
Yeah, I think that part of the work that I am here to do is to fuel what I call the heart-centered revolution. And I think it's all based on reconnection. Like the subtitle of the book, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, is about reconnecting to ourselves and to our communities and to our planet. And I think that the first sort of steps in reconnection is slowing down. This culture is so fast paced. It's so based on frenzy and going up and up and up, that to slow down and to start noticing what's around you and including your inner world, starting to like actually regain the connection between our brain and our bodies. And then the willingness to feel it all. I think all of those things contribute to the practice of reconnection. And then learning how to take breaks and resource ourselves, because in a world that is like, you know, disrupting constantly, to always be leaning in and feeling it all can really lead to burnout and overwhelm. And so how do we learn the practice of tuning in, feeling it all, resourcing ourselves, taking breaks, and then like practicing that in a cycle?
Yeah, no, I definitely got caught up in it all because when it comes to tackling world issues like climate, because of its urgency, it's so easy to continue to focus on the action and
Yeah.
then forget to, take time for ourselves and slow down. I definitely, um, yeah, I learned my lesson the hard way this summer. But yeah, I love that you call yourself a truth seeker, and I also wanted to pick your brains about that. What does truth seeking mean to you, and how do you seek truth in a time where there's just an almost overwhelming amount of information out there?
Such a timely question, Heidi. Okay, so I think I started being a truth seeker when I was quite young. My mom lies at a sort of pathological level. And because of that, when you're a kid, it's incredibly confusing to figure out, like, is this true? Is this not true? And from a young age, I think I just really started looking for facts I could substantiate, like really using my discernment, really using the information around me. And in my later years, I was able to incorporate my heart in understanding what's true. But also in my early years in college, in my undergrad, I was trained as a scientist. And so really being able to pay attention to details, to make connections between things that maybe seemed disconnected. And then now I ask who stands to benefit from what truth is being portrayed. And I think it's really important to really engage that heart and that discernment and who stands to benefit as we're looking at what really is truth.
Yeah, that's really powerful perspective. Yeah, I feel like that lens is super important, especially now, more than ever. Yeah, and I guess like related to that, in your opinion, what role do emotional intelligence and empathy play in addressing complex societal issues?
Your questions are so vast and I think really important, and we only get like a teaser of an answer. And so I invite you and anyone listening to enter into a bigger dialogue about these kinds of things. The first thing that comes to mind is, you said you learned the hard way because we're so action oriented in this culture that it will lead to burnout. Sacrificing action on behalf of tending to our emotional worlds, particularly our wounding, our grief, our fear, terror, anxiety, all of those things that we've kind of been taught to shy away from will collapse us internally. Inevitably it will. And so we have to actually learn how to increase our distress tolerance. We have to learn how to process grief. We have to learn how to um, be with the things that scare us so that as we dive into action, that action is actually really well resourced. And I'll pivot now, but I come back time and time again to this quote by Alice Walker that says, only if we can stop the terrorism in our own hearts will we be able to stop the terrorism in the world. Mm. And so many of us think like these issues are collective. They're so much bigger than me. What does my own emotional world have to do with it? But the fear and the grief and the tumult in our own worlds, in our inner worlds, end up being projected into our actions in the outer world. And I think that until we can fully really understand what Alice Walker is saying there, until we do this inner work, so we stop perpetuating that othering, that fear of other into the world, we're gonna keep perpetuating the same toxic culture that exists now. And again, these ideas are so big and so complex that, like we could do a 4-day workshop on this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, no, definitely. I like for a time like neglected my inner world, so to speak. I you talk about this in How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, but like that period of like long dark, I kind of had like a personal bit of that. And I think like yeah, no, I've been having an incredibly tough time pulling away from my old tendencies, and I've been, like grieving what used to work and doesn't work any longer. But the issue is, it feels like everywhere around me is a reminder of how things used to be, and it's been very easy to like fall into hopelessness and denial when it feels like moving away from what no longer works is an isolating experience. What advice do you have for this?
Yeah, I think that it's brave for you to acknowledge what you just acknowledged, and that for me, in the times that I've experienced something similar, that it's a kind of death. It's a kind of death of worldview. It's a kind of death of way of being. And I think that requires time and patience and compassion. And that's really hard, to show ourselves compassion and to actually like change. Transformation is incredibly hard. And we talk about it, like we can talk about it in this podcast, but actually to do it is painful. It requires time and energy. And again, I'm going to use this word patience because we don't really allow ourselves like spaciousness and patience to work through these kinds of things. And the other thing that I would say is for me, I feel like I'm always working against the grain. Like a lot of the people in my life don't want to talk about the severity of the issues. And I'm a firm believer that unless we can talk about them, with some level of authenticity and vulnerability, that it's not particularly helpful to solving the poly crisis. And so for me, instead of continuously living in this sort of like hopeless, despairing, like, why isn't everybody else on board? I try to find my own grounding in my values. Why? My whys. I try to figure out what my whys are, why I want to do this work, and how I can continue to minimize harm and maximize connection and healing. And like, that's what drives me now. So it's sort of like I can keep going, of course, with rest and with breaks and patience and all the things we've been talking about, but I can keep going even against the grain of the dominant culture and the people who want to unplug and avoid and all those things, as long as I know I'm trying my best to minimize harm and maximize connection and healing in this time.
I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, and like I guess like kind of related to that, like this summer, I I kind of spoke on this earlier, but like I totally lost myself in burnout and disillusionment. And I felt like I was going crazy. So like your book, it was a really great help in helping me reground myself. And so I guess to talk about or shift conversation towards your book, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate was a labor of love. Why did this book come about, and what have been some notable experiences for you, or what were some notable experiences for you in the process of writing it?
Well, as you're discovering in this interview, I am really verbose. I really like words. I like to talk. I like to explain through the things that I'm thinking, and ideas really excite me. And I think one of the limitations of writing a book is that it's like the sort of a permanent document.
Mm.
And in a time where the world is changing so quickly, like, nimbleness and sort of impermanence actually serve us.
Mhm.
So one of the biggest obstacles is like, how do you create something that's going to move us and help us be in dialogue and help? I think we use the analogy of like moving the needle forward. Like, our intention is to generate conversations, to generate inspiration and ideas. But then you have to like formalize it in this
Mhm.
book that doesn't move. Um,
Mhm.
and that's hard. That's hard. And then like writing out these practices, like a practice. Okay. Our culture tends to intellectualize. That's what we're doing right now, right?
Mhm.
We're
Mhm.
talking about ideas. We're not doing the ideas or practicing them. And so the book is full of practices, but they're practices that have been intellectualized and written down. And so the
Mhm.
other thing that I was concerned about while writing it is, how do we get people to actually not just read this book, but to embody the book, to practice the practices, to try the things that we're suggesting? How can we convince them, or how can we suggest to them that the practice is more important than the intellectualizing of the information?
Yeah, that's a really tough thing, but I think like you achieved those, I guess, like objectives very masterfully. Yeah, I mean, I think this is like written around the time of like just coming out of the pandemic, but it's like it's very timeless, and everything's so relevant right now. And in terms of the practices, I found them really helpful, and I when I like actually took the time to do them. Yeah, and your writing throughout it is just incredibly powerful. And this one analogy that you wrote about really struck me. Being socialized, and I'm quoting, being socialized in the dominant culture is a lot like being raised in a dysfunctional family. And, as I'm kind of like working through that dysfunctional family that I've been raised in the midst of this dominant culture, in the face of it, you call connection a form of rebellion. Can you expand on that idea?
Um, uh, the 10-step program that Good Grief runs, a lot of that has inspiration from classic 12-step modalities, but specifically adult children of alcoholics. And when I started unpacking my dysfunctional family and its impact on me, and again, back to your first question about sort of the human condition and the cultural dysfunction that leads to familial dysfunction, I came across Dr. Claudia Black, who teaches about the three rules of dysfunctional families, which is don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And I don't think it's too much of a I don't know. I don't think it's too much to see that playing out in the dominant culture. Like we're operating with those three same rules at large, right? We're not allowed to talk about our despair, our grief, our terror. We're not allowed to talk about genocides and wars. We're not allowed to talk about social injustices or structural racism or the fact that capitalism is killing the planet. Anytime we try to enter into those really hard, gritty conversations, we're told like we're pessimists, we're not really seeing the value of the systems that are set up. You know, we're taught to not trust each other, we're taught to isolate and compete, and certainly we're not taught how to feel. Like feeling is extra, you know, like if you have time and energy to feel, then you can feel. But predominantly those rules that very much live and grow within dysfunctional families, we see them writ large in the Western world. We see them in the dominant culture. And I think another downfall is this obsession with positivity and hope. Like we have to have a positive outcome. We're going to be fine. We have to maintain hope. But I think that this insistence on that framework and not allowing for these darker, these heavier, these more painful aspects of life, of the human condition, of the outcome of this Western culture is really one, impeding our maturity. We're not allowing ourselves to become mature human beings, but it leads to mass isolation. It leads to self and collective harming, and it doesn't prepare us to cope in a changing world. And so social scientist Susie Moser suggests that like we need spaces to get real about it. And I love that framing is like, where do we get real about the state of the world and our feelings associated with it in our own personal stories about how this Western culture impacts us? And so how do we create spaces that are brave enough to hold not just the beauty and the joy and the love and all the things that we really like about being human, but where can we go where our grief and our terror and our rage can be met with responsive action and not reactionary action? How can we learn to be with each other in the tumult without trying to fix it and just bearing witness to each other? I think connection is a rebellion because it is only through connection to ourselves, to others in the planet, that we gain emotional and spiritual and psychological strength to endure these times.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I guess, like, we really need to break out of that silence through normalizing our grief in the face of environmental and societal challenges. And I guess, how would you describe what it means to grieve, and why is it crucial for individuals and communities?
Questions are so great, Heidi.
Thank you.
Let's spend an hour on this one. My wife often says, if you're not grieving right now, I grieve for you.
Mm.
Because there's no lack of things to be deeply, profoundly sad about right now. If you're paying attention, you know, there's all these reports about the North Atlantic current potentially being overturned, the Amazon's transforming to a savanna. We have decimated something like 72 or 73% of all wildlife on the planet. Not to mention, again, the genocides, the wars, the imperialistic militarization of the world and of this dominant culture trying to move into other spaces and saying you don't have a right to exist. You know, like it doesn't take too much work to just absolutely have your heart broken. And what we've not done as a culture is provided a pathway where that grief can be normalized, where we can actually like move it and learn lessons from it. And I think what's often left out of the grief conversation is that grief is a really collective emotion. Like these things that I pointed to, I just like listed off all these horrible things that we're facing right now. And that's not even all of them. But that's too much for a single nervous system. And the process of grief requires support and it requires connection. And yet so many of us don't know how to connect in an authentic way. And so in order to normalize the grieving process, I think we need to figure out how to build strong enough communities to hold the magnitude, the weight, the depth of that grief. And I think to take this question one step further, we think grief just means sadness, but I think in our process of really deconstructing what grief is, that grief looks different for everybody. Grief can be rage, it can be despair, it can be fear, and all of that can fall under this giant umbrella of grief.
Yeah, I appreciate that you point that out because yeah, definitely it's a collective experience that's incredibly diverse. And I guess like moving towards your experience, if you could turn back time, butterfly effects aside, and tell your younger self something that you've learned from life so far, what would you say to them?
Butterfly effects aside,
Yeah.
that's a great little side note. I because my family was involved in the Holocaust, I got very obsessed from a young age, studying the history of World War II and Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And, I came across the ideas of Viktor Frankl quite young and have been incredibly moved and touched by them. And one lesson that he teaches that we try to bring into Good Grief Network is that even under the most despairing conditions, like beauty is available to us. And there's a lot of magic in this world. And people can define magic however they want to, but I think there's a lot of magic in this world. And as we fall into this desperation, as we fall into this despair, we need to actively be practicing the discovery of beauty and awe because it's there. But sometimes our minds and our bodies and the overwhelm of the world can really keep us from noticing what's still here. And I wish that I had that tool all along in my life. And I wish that I could teach that tool to other people because we're all going to go through different bouts of despair and grief as the polycrisis continues. But there is still beauty, there's still joy, there's still connectivity available to us. And now is the time that we start practicing how to embody those things.
No, that tool, I mean, I feel like you've definitely created it with Good Grief Network. And I mean, I've personally found the Gen Z program with Annalisa and Susan that you kind of helped create really helpful. What are some favorite resources of yours, be they from GGN or others, that you would recommend listeners check out?
I love resources and I love sharing resources. It's like one of my favorite aspects of what I do. Um, I am always reading more about trauma and about somatics because I think what's happening right now is the inundation of personal and collective trauma, like on all sorts of levels. And so I recommend that people learn a little bit more about trauma responses and about how trauma actually is disconnecting for survival reasons. But if we're in a constantly traumatic time, how do we still connect even though our response to protect us is disconnecting? That in itself seems like a little bit of a paradox. I also am really digging polyvagal theory as a framework to see the world through. Um, but yeah, and I have podcast recommendations or like I recommend people like Bio Kamalafe and Prentice Hemphill, trying to learn a lot about the things I don't yet know. And we can offer some more recommendations maybe in the show notes or something like that about a couple of the resources I'm digging. And before we get off this subject, I wanted to suggest to you because you said something uh, like you got lost this summer, or you didn't use those words exactly, but that's kind of how I interpreted it. And I am really guided by Bio Kamalafe's idea that like we have to get lost. Like we're so indoctrinated by this dominant culture that actually it's an opening to be lost. And of course, that's really disorienting. It's horrible to feel it. This is the idea where we can intellectualize these ideas, but in practice, it sucks. It hurts and
Yeah.
it's harmful. But if we are so patterned, if we are so stuck in the dominant culture's way of being that we don't even notice how the dominant culture is living through us, then those times of being really lost and unmoored and disoriented actually end up being opportunities to maybe do something different. And so as as messed up as it sounds, I want to invite other people into getting lost, into getting unmoored, and the only thing is that we have to remember that we're not in it alone, because I think that's where we can get really lost. It's how do we enhance those connections so we have a willingness to let go of the familiar.
Yeah, no, I just thought about what you wrote at the beginning, like in the preface of the book, like we are at the top of a mountain and we know we cannot go back the way we came. Our descent is not illuminated or marked. There's no path. No one has been here before. It is unknown. It can feel scary and we must move forward. When I read that, I was like, oh, let me break down real quick. Yeah, no, but I really appreciated that and I really appreciate this conversation, Laura. So I guess like I don't know, for listeners who want to keep up with the work that you do and continue the conversation, where can they find you?
Yeah, Good Grief Network's website, we're on all the major socials. We offer the 10-step program that the book is kind of built around. It's built around the framework of the 10-step program. We run them in community a couple times a year. We'll be booking in January again for those 10-step programs, but we're also starting to offer a lot more events. We'll have events surrounding the election. We'll have events surrounding, we have a workshop coming up that's called Both and it's like how to live in paradox, how to be with the grief and the gratitude. It's trying to enhance our capacity to be with these unsolvable things. And then the thing I'm really excited about is our upcoming facilitation program. We take a number of students every year and we run them through a pretty intensive 12-week process so that they feel empowered to bring peer support spaces into their own communities. And we teach them through the framework of the 10-step program, but certainly you don't have to run the 10-step program. It enables you, it empowers you to just, minimize tension or minimize harm while honoring that tension exists whenever we're talking about our emotional worlds and like building new futures and all of those things. But yeah, I love teaching the class. I love the students who come in there, and time and time again, even though it's a pretty intensive course, we hear how transformative of a process it is because we talk about some theory, but we also have practice. And, we try to show people how to open our hearts and how to be connective and bring that back into their own local communities.
I appreciate that so much, and I'll definitely be checking out those resources. But yeah, no, thank you again so much, Laura, for taking the time to speak with me. I learned a lot from this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. And I wish you well with your burnout recovery. And, just I can't announce, share, teach enough about the importance of rest and, having these spaces to do our inner work so that those of us who want to be change makers can actually sustain ourselves in the work. I wish healing and connection and joy for you, Heidi.
Thank you.